University of Western Australia. The motion is that we should abolish Greenbelt regulations, where Greenbelt regulations are understood to be regulations preventing development beyond a certain geographic boundary. Do you have a ballot, or?
I don't.
We'll sort that out later. In the meantime, though, I'll just put that there for your benefit. Any questions standing on the floor of the normal? Fine, in which case it gives me enormous pleasure to call on Daniel to open the case that stands in his name.
Mr. Speaker, Greenbelts were conceived to do three things. They were conceived to halt the unsustainable spread of urban centres, to protect flora and fauna, and to improve the quality of life for all citizens in a country. What we're here to tell you today is they have spectacularly failed in doing so. Especially in the developing world, around cities like Sao Paulo and Rio de Janeiro, what were supposed to be greenbelts have become slums and dead zones which force the development of satellite cities and destroy both the lives of the poor and desperate, but also the environmental assets in terms of animals and flora that we sought to protect. What we believe is that green zones are an incredibly inefficient method of protecting the environment, and we propose that they should essentially be abolished, that these territories should be treated like all other land to be released by the government, and the resources that are gained by selling off these territories should be used to protect both social and environmental objectives in far more efficient ways. What I'm going to be giving you in my speech is an explanation of, firstly, what green zones were designed to do and why specifically they have failed in doing so. Secondly, I'm going to talk about why development is the best mechanism to facilitate environmental protection, particularly in the developing world. And finally, I'm going to explain why the current green zone system is mutually exclusive with a whole raft of far more efficient environmental policies that we would like to see, like, for example, the preservation of the Amazon rainforest and areas in rural areas. So to start with this first area, I've already flagged why green zones were developed in the first place. People saw massively expanding cities, particularly in the developing world, and the people in the suburbs, usually the more wealthy, usually the more influential, decided that they thought this was a mechanism by which they could prevent the spread of these cities. But every time we've seen these technologies, this mechanism deployed, they essentially fail. They fail for a couple of reasons. The first thing is that the draw of the employment and the financial certainty that these cities provide is simply so great that the poor from surrounding areas need to migrate. They feel a need to do so, otherwise they forfeit their ability to earn a living. The wage discrepancy between the urban centres and the surrounding areas is so great, they must access those urban centres, and we think they have a right to do so. So what you've seen is two particular results. For those who have the resources to do so, they build essentially satellite cities. These are urban settlements that exist beyond the green zone belt, and they then commute through that green zone belt using automobiles due to the absence of railways and other government resources within those green zones, which undermines the very environmental objective in the first place, because now you have this very inefficient scheme of a very expensive zone of green and people commuting through it. But more accurately, for those who are very poor, they set up in these green zones anyway. The green zones of Rio have essentially become filled with favelas and slums as individuals squat. And periodically, the well-to-do use these regulations to come through, bulldoze their residences, and then they come right back, because the draw is simply irresistible. That is why they failed to control the spread of these cities. Secondly, they've failed in preserving flora and fauna. Firstly, because it's a very efficient mechanism to do so, and secondly, for the reasons I just told you, in that they're occupied by people anyway. But even when they do work, they failed in preserving flora and fauna. Two sub-reasons to this. Firstly, because it's an extremely inefficient and very expensive way of doing so. This land is often very expensive, and so the opportunity cost incurred by the government here has prevented them from taking other mechanisms. I'll deal with that more later. But even when you do preserve the green territory, eventually that has to be rolled back. Eventually, the city's boundary necessarily has to expand, and what we see is that animal populations that become dependent on these green zones face sudden and complete eviction from their territory. So you saw this with the golden lion tamarin in Burma, where essentially the green zone that encompassed the entire species habitat became encapsulated within a city. So instead of that city gradually expanding and the population of that species naturally being pushed back into the rainforest where it could survive, it now had to be displaced en masse when that green zone was rolled back. That has led to extinctions in species throughout Southeast Asia and similar dangers in sort of South America. The third idea of protecting people's ability to actualise themselves is that we think this is incredibly immoral, because the cost has essentially been borne by the people who would develop there, the poor. The cost here has been borne by the poor who are denied access to expanding infrastructure into these green zones, who have been forced to squat in these green zones, and who have seen the property prices in the cities that they need to access driven up by these green zones. The only people who have benefited, even when this policy has succeeded, are the urban wealthy, the NIMBYs, who don't want to have neighbours next to them and would rather stare at trees no matter the social cost. And that leads me well into our principal point, both why this is immoral and why development is the best mechanism to ensure economic development. I need to preface this point by saying that development is an imperative. Poor countries have a responsibility to the majority of their population to ensure that poverty is alleviated in the long run. We recognise that there are two mechanisms by which you can confront growing environmental harm. Firstly, you can keep people in an essentially Stone Age state where they don't actually access modern resources and industrialisation, or you can get them industrialised to the point where you have the resources available to do it responsibly. We favour the latter. So why does that development essentially allow you to put forward development? We think that there are two sub-points specifically within this development point. Firstly, is it enables government to access superior quantities of funds. So what you see at the moment with these essential slums and dead zones within these green zones is you're missing out on a whole bunch of development, but also legal dead zones where a tax base could potentially be garnered and be developed in the first place. What you're missing out with in terms of denying urban development is granting the government resources that can potentially use to finance other environmental protection schemes. Secondly, they're also foregoing the cost and the value that would be gained from selling these territories, which could further be used. But in terms of affecting the economy and the population as a whole, if you can get people into these areas, living legally, participating in jobs, being able to access education and healthcare infrastructure, you essentially expand and develop the middle class. And it's the middle class that essentially have fueled the environmental program around the world. Why? Because they're not distracted by the immediate need to survive, the immediate need to eke out an existence, and have an interest in broader issues like the preservation of the planet as a whole. They also have the education and resources in order to understand and be aware of these issues on a global scale. And what we've seen politically is the middle class in these countries that agitates most for environmental control, be that in China or in South America. So when you give people access to this education and resources, you increase the ability of them to push further environmental trade-offs in the future. Thirdly, we'd say that in terms of the actual programs themselves, in terms of the safety of these programs, there are a lot of hidden costs associated with green zones in these countries. So in these dead zones, in these slums, you're wasting a huge amount of human capital. These are areas that are festooned with crime, these areas aren't covered by state authorities, these areas are dead zones for health, and we see infectious disease including them as well. All of these are a raft of invisible costs that accumulate because you simply refuse to accept that poor people have a right to and a duty to and an ability to seek out jobs in the cities. We're having to avoid that. But the final point that I want to bring you is this. Why is this mechanism of environmental protection mutually exclusive with other mechanisms of protection? I've given you the basal reasoning. Because it denies government access to resources, because it denies you political accountability and the ability to agitate for those sorts of changes. But you have to get inside the heads of individuals themselves as well. If individuals are suffering on a daily basis, if they're seeing their livelihoods destroyed by environmental policy, they're also mutually alienated against environmental policy. If you turn the focus, for example, away from urban areas, if you turn the focus of environmental policy away from blocking people from building homes and houses and towards things like improving the efficiency of the technology using your power plants, or going out into rural areas where few people live and actually financing the protection of the rainforest, the Amazon, for example, which has far more environmental value, which has far more ecological value, which has far more cultural value to the people of Brazil or the people of Argentina than these bans within the cities have, then you bring the populace back on side for those particular ones, and you have the resources available to do it. Given how much cheaper and more efficient it would be to protect areas that developers aren't instantly after, that aren't needed for urgent economic development, that aren't currently populated by persons, it's stupid for us to take the resources that could be allocated there and instead use them as a mechanism to beat down the poor. Mr. Speaker, green zones are morally reprehensible. They put the cost of protecting the environment on the poorest of people. They force them to continue to live in the Stone Age, when in reality the cost should be borne by the urban elite protecting areas that are worth protecting in the jungle, in the Amazon. I'm proud to propose.
I'd like to thank that gentleman for that speech, and now call a change over the case called Uruguay.
Mr. Chair, we think it's the choice of the government when to expand that green belt, not private developers. We think that the Chinese government should have the choice to decide that there's now enough innovation, enough population density in certain areas, and then gradually expand that green belt out in a logical way. We think that investors always rush in and try to buy up and create that urban sprawl because it's cheaper for them to get ahead of the market and predict where that city is going to go and buy it up in large swathes then. And we think that actually hurts the poor people more. 2 points of rebuttal before I tell you about the environmental and social impetuses of the Greenbelt policy. Firstly, they told us that green belts failed in the past. Firstly, a precursor to that. The example of Rio that they gave is one for our side of the house, because in Rio, that was a failure of enforcement by the government. You still saw urban sprawl in Rio when the cities and the ghettoized communities spread out away from those greenbelt communities. We think that no one's policy in this side solves that fundamental failure of government. However, we would give you a myriad of other examples. Look at Hong Kong, China, Macau, all these areas where the Greenbelt policy has led them to build up, to innovate their cities, to create more efficient cities and more innovative cities in that way. But furthermore, to congregate the poor in a way that allows them to best provide services for those poor people, because it's a lot easier to provide services when people are geographically closer together, and you don't have to deal with distance in that way. They gave us some other arguments why urban sprawl had failed in the past. They said that the poor needed to migrate, so for those with resources, they built up satellite cities. We call lie on this, right? If you had the resources to migrate, why would you build up a satellite city instead of moving to Beijing, the hub within the center of the urban sprawl? Secondly, they told us that for people with no resources, they just squatted outside the cities. We say once again, that's just a problem with enforcement. We would enforce that people couldn't squat outside, we would provide them with subsidies to move into these urban sprawls, we would provide them with the means to enforce our policy. Then they told us that the urban sprawl system failed because it failed to preserve flora and fauna when people squatted there. So even if we can't enforce it, we think that your policy destroys flora and fauna more at the point where developers can come in and destroy that flora and fauna with mass industrial developments, and our policy does it less if the only people living in the flora and fauna are squatters. Secondly, they brought this point to say that development is always better under their policy. We have two responses. On the logical level, we say that development is always easier when you can concentrate your services to a geographical area and provide more efficient services in that way. But on an empirical level, we tell you this. China knows that it can only provide its services best to people when they are concentrated in cities. It's used greenbelts to collect up these people and force them into certain areas so it can provide things like hospitals, provide things like schools that most efficiently can serve the greatest number of people. 2 points in substantive. One, on the environmental impetus of the greenbelt policy. 4 subpoints. The first subpoint is dealing with problems when you can't contain cities otherwise. So we think that often greenbelts are used in a wide, wide surface area to keep cities as a whole contained. We think that this does a few good things. This means that you can concentrate transport costs. It means that people aren't driving from buses kilometers away from the city to get into work each day. We think that you reduce carbon when you can have efficient mass transport systems like railway lines and buses instead of cars for every single person. We think furthermore that you have to spread facilities in this way. So governments have to build 100 houses instead of one apartment complex that can have the same number of people in this way. We think that's incredibly environmentally damaging when you have to have such mass development instead of concentrated development. But furthermore, on a logical level, we think that urban sprawl is an opt-out to innovation in these cases. We see in countries like New York and countries like Singapore, where they're incredibly efficient at building economies of scale in high-rise buildings. They do things put plants in these buildings as carbon sinks. They do things have incredibly efficient water recycling systems because they're being forced to innovate by policies like the Greenbelt policy. Your policy allows developers to be lazy and build out instead of solving those problems in an innovative way within the system. But secondly, we think that our Greenbelt policy allows for the protection of specifically important plots of land. This is a different type of urban sprawl. This means that you're specifically targeting greenbelts to certain areas, and we think that that's important. We think this does things like protect pristine environmental benefits in that place, like beachland, when developers always have an incentive to come in and develop that beachland as fast as possible. We think that this removes ruins of public good to lots of people in society. We think it protects land that is important to indigenous and native groups that often have to protect that land in long-term, hard-to-win court battles when they can't prevent developers from coming in the first place. We think that greenbelts are a flexible way of doing that. We think that it does things like prevent in China a lot of pollution and smog in that way. When a city is starting to develop and developers rush into the edges of that city to try and build up their factories and get the most bang for their buck in doing so, you can put a greenbelt around that and stop those factories being built in that willy-nilly way. We think that it provides for things like lush forests and putting greenbelts around those areas to provide for incredibly important carbon capture natural systems in this case. We think that this is furthermore incredibly important in the environmental sense to protecting things like endangered species and really sensitive ecosystems that would be destroyed by a development. We think that the environment is important, thirdly, because the environment often has a human cost. So the insulation of smog, providing of carbon capture is beneficial to human existence, but the market doesn't solve for that. We think that you can also protect future consumers in a way that the market doesn't solve for as well. Because the market only deals with consumers that are involved in that particular transaction. But greenbelts provide for people who aren't involved in that transaction, when it can be more efficient later on. We think that's an intrinsic value often to local groups that isn't recognized by the market in this way. Furthermore, on failures of the market, we think that it doesn't value positive externality. So it doesn't value things like beauty and culture in transactions. It doesn't value future consumers. It doesn't value like efficiency in these transactions. And we think the government should do its best to provide for that. On the social level, we think that there's a context of increased rates of urbanization and like a population growth in the third world. We think that this leads to 4 different harms. Firstly, we think that the services like that the government provides has to be dependent on like the geographical area of those services, not just the population levels. That means that government needs to provide transport infrastructure that will that they'll need to provide more of that to deal with larger geographical areas. That means they have to provide health facilities that have to sweep across different areas because there's a limited amount of time in an emergency for you to get to that health facility. That means you have to provide education facilities in the same way, and policing facilities in the same way. All these services are based on the amount of land which they cover, not the amount of people they provide for, and that's why the Greenbelt policy makes a more efficient system for society in that way. But secondly, we say that all the problems that I just mentioned there are exacerbated by people, like poor people, buying up areas outside the Greenbelts. We think that these people are the most reliant on government services, and when they live the furthest away, those services become the least efficient. We think that Greenbelts solve this in general. We think they're an incredibly flexible tool that government can manipulate in this, in many different ways. And we think that they fill a gap in government's tool pocket because right now, governments have to fight against incredibly wealthy developers on many, many different fronts in multiple court battles instead of using this incredibly efficient tool that is the Greenbelt policy to stave off all these developers in one fell swoop. We think that's incredibly efficient in that way. Furthermore, we think that empirically, governments who can't afford it have already used greenbelts in this way to protect their societies. For instance, in China, when the government knows they just can't cater to every single small province around China, they enforce that greenbelt because they definitely know that that greenbelt will allow them to congregate the poor people in the right area to allow them to administer the services in this way. And finally, we think that the government stifles innovation at the point where it allows developers to spread out in willy-nilly as they wish. Because you don't force the same market forces to apply. It's always cheaper for governments to say, for developers to say, we'll just build out of this. We'll build more houses outside. We'll predict where the market is going and build it in an inefficient way. Instead of saying, we'll spend a long time, we'll do a lot of research and provide for these areas by researching new and innovative technologies. Because we think greenbelts stifle innovations, because we think there's a social and environmental impetus for them, we're very, very proud to propose.
Thank you, gentlemen, for that speech, and I call on Steph D'Souza to continue the case from Albert.
Mr. Speaker, Shane's speech was by and large pretty uncontroversial. If we had a fixed number of people and we could concentrate them in a fixed area, they would continue to innovate, continue to make reforms that would make that city a nice place to live. That's why living inside the Greenbelt is a good thing. The point of the Greenbelt is that as people get richer, they want a nice backyard. But the problem is the population is increasing. Urban sprawl is inevitable on both sides of this debate. The point is how we manage it. And on our side of the House, we're sick of prioritizing the rights of rich people to live amongst flora and fauna over the rights of poor people to have access to a job that isn't 3 hours away. More importantly, please respond to the imperative of this debate that all of these green zones, when implemented in the developing world, are barren wastelands where favelas spring up and are unregulated. I'll substantiate that more than Daniel has already done. We'll hear a response at second day, I presume. Several thousand points of rebuttal. First of all, they told us in the beginning of the speech that it should be the choice of the government, not developers, where development occurs. Our model didn't preclude government regulation of the speed of development. It didn't preclude that the state infrastructure existed to moderate where developers go. So the problem of large development growing in large swathes within these areas is nullified by that. But on our side of the House, we probably don't care. Why is that? Because more people have a right to live closer to cities, live closer to where economic opportunities exist, so that they can then access the rights that they wanted to talk about on that side of the House, such as cheap transport, such as jobs. What did they say in response? Well, let's look to China and the way that they've managed this. We don't actually think this debate is super relevant to China because they prevent internal migration anyway. What is the meaning of that? It means China is an authoritarian state willing to condemn whole swathes of the population to peasantry. You have to live in this particular rural zone for the rest of your life. That is the problem with the Greenbelt. It caps people's opportunities. Please respond. In Daniel's speech, and this is my second point of rebuttal, What were the purposes of the Greenbelt when it was invented and when it was conceived, other than my cynical view that it was invented by rich people to keep their backyards nice? Firstly, we told you that it was designed to prevent rapid and unsustainable development. First of all, given that urban sprawl is intractable, it means that people squat on that land anyway, the urban sprawl is still continuing, and people live outside those communities. And the satellite cities that exist around Sao Paulo exist. Maybe we can go and look at the world map to prove that to you, but they exist, they're there. That was the only challenge. What Shane said to us was, he called lie on it and they should just move to Beijing. That's the point. Beijing is full. There's nowhere for them to live. They have to live outside, but all the jobs are in Beijing. They should be allowed to live closer to where there's economic empowerment. The second thing we told you is that the purpose of the Greenbelt was to foster flora and fauna. And Daniel gave you the example of when you isolate particular animals within areas, even if these Greenbelts do exist, which you don't think they do, then when you inevitably have to waive the regulation in those Greenbelts, those particular flora and fauna are displaced, like the gold lion tamarin in Burma. What do they tell us in response? Well, actually, the developers will probably eliminate the animal population anyway. Because of the inconsistent application of greenbelts, because they're so politicized, we think that's a good reason to abolish them. Gradual change that means animals necessarily, maybe unideally, get forced out of the cities is better than constantly moving them around between the greenbelts. Animals will survive better in the wild than they will in these favela-like lands where nothing really happens. What was Shane's substandard material? He told us that it's good to concentrate costs concentrate people in certain areas, because then you can provide them with services easier. This was uncontentious. What they had to tell us was why it was good to concentrate people outside of the green zone and why that would be good for them. All of the harms of his substantive material were exacerbated when you put a necessary green buffer between people accessing innovation. The second part of the substantive material was that innovation occurs within these particular areas in order to make us more efficient. But the example he used was the innovation which occurred within New York, the global financial capital, which then has a ring of poverty around it as a result of this type of policy. We do not want to entrench that as a precedent, but he did not acknowledge the people living outside of that innovation where nothing occurs except a stunted growth. But also didn't respond to Daniel's material about how the corruption and inconsistent application of the Greenbelt means that that innovation isn't likely. The final area of rebuttal is the principled area of this debate. Who does the state have an obligation to? We think in the developing world they have an obligation to poor people that were born into a below the poverty line standard of living and should have access to the jobs that a functioning economy give, but rich people are enfranchised in order to fetishize the environment. We think that's problematic because people don't have food in their mouth. But even if we put the environment as the top priority of this debate, we think it is more likely that people will be able to lobby for environmental reform when they have more money, because they have more education, they have more ability to fund, say, alternative energy, to change their consumption habits, to change the way they access the environment. We think our priority is enlarging the middle class. That means allowing people to live closer to cities, allowing them to have access to more money, therefore environmental reform will improve. We need a response to that. All we had was, China is efficient at doing this, and that means that this model will work in order to standardize people's standard of living. That's exactly the problem. It caps that standard of living at a certain point and doesn't allow those countries to develop for the majority of people, only just the rich, only the rich. Okay. My substantive material will be taking it to the streets. I'm going to be talking about the favelas and how they are functionally abandoned by the state. Secondly, I'm going to talk about political capital. So, when Shane told us that these were efficient areas, because once we congregate people together, we can provide them with services, we actually think that these are forgotten areas. The whole point of the Greenbelt is that you're not allowed to live there. So what incentive does the government have to provide the hospitals and education systems and police infrastructures that Shane wanted to wax lyrical about? What happens in these Greenbelts is they are abandoned favelas. They're abandoned by the state. They are festering, hot pots of crime. The metric's running thin at this point. But the problem is, even if they weren't, nobody is allowed to have stability within that state, because the state every once in a while comes and pushes you out. That means necessarily you have instability, inconsistency in your life. What are the effects of that for the individuals? They're never able to pursue meaningful employment because they never have a good base from which to do that at home, Mr. Speaker, to which they're entitled. How does our model change that? The money spent enforcing this Greenbelt can be spent on providing community housing, can be spent on providing state infrastructure for the people not only living currently on the green zone, but in the green belt, but also living outside to provide more trains more often to the people living there. It's good for everybody on the ground. There's no state infrastructure within these developments. Second point is substantive. Under the status quo, in developing countries, but even in the developed world, coming from Australia, where any talking about the environment is a poison chalice, nobody wants to take up the onus of putting the environment on the table. How does the Greenbelt retard the development of that? When an individualized harm is seen to you, you cannot access your job because as a result of this environmental policy, you have to take a 3-hour train to work. You necessarily become maligned against the idea of supporting environmental policy. Therefore, it's not popular to invent more nuanced, more innovative forms of reform, like subsidizing alternative energy, like making sure that people consume less of non-renewable resources, etc. Those things are not popular, they won't be put on the policy table, and they'll never be discussed in an innovative way, because we've already solved the problem, guys. The Greenbelt exists. Mr. Speaker, we had 3 key aims as a result of our case. We wanted to eliminate the barren wastelands that were Greenbelt. We wanted to stop forcing poor people to bear the cost of what rich people want, and we wanted more development more often, so all of us could afford the cost of environmental reform. Happy to propose.
Thank you, Steph. And I'm going to call upon Max.
Too busy, I think, throwing chairs around.
Try and keep it together. Got a long day.
Mr. Speaker, the entire affirmative case so far has been predicated on the idea that green zones can only really exist in Brazil. What we've told you throughout our entire bench is that green zones are applied by governments all around the world. This debate is not just about how corrupt the local government of Sao Paulo is. This debate is about whether or not green zones work in Hong Kong. It's whether or not about how green zones have helped limit urban spread in Beijing around the world. Because just because China doesn't limit internal migration doesn't mean there is a massive demand for more building in these various parts of the world. What they fundamentally misunderstood is that green zones are a limit on urban growth, which in turn incentivises people to build up. They wanted to tell you that green zones stop people from, well, make like rich people have lots and lots of backyards. Here's the thing, guys. Green zones make that economically unviable and give an incentive to property developers to make sure that doesn't happen, because that land is so much more valuable when it is used for housing anyway. Green zones don't pervert outcomes for poor people, they improve them. I've got 3 points of rebuttal. Firstly, I'm going to ask you a question about what the appropriate role of government is in this debate. Secondly, I'm going to talk about what are the environmental impacts of this. Thirdly, I'm going to talk about an issue I've just labelled as social stuff, which is the stuff which doesn't fit into the first 2 points. So firstly, on the role of government. We told you in today's debate that we need to make a choice about who controls the spread in cities around the world, whether that be in developing countries or whether that be in developed countries. We told you that this choice was between government setting mandates for where people can build in these areas, or developers, which have an incentive to always improve more. We told you that the incentives for developers were always going to be perniciously maligned because developers don't bear the full costs of moving people into these cities. Shane gave you a lot of material about how the social costs of people moving into these urban areas and using up existing infrastructure and demanding that governments make more infrastructure through continuous expansion of urban boundaries was disproportionately borne on other people in society, including poor people who may have moved there a few years earlier and who genuinely need government policy the most. What was their response to this? The response of which was to say that, well, the interests of people moving into these cities are always aligned with the interests of developers. Firstly, we tell you that in some circumstances isn't so. Secondly, it doesn't respond to the broader point about how this actually impacts other people living in those cities. Because as much as they wanted to malign everyone currently living within the urban confines of Rio is rich, we tell you that is not the case at all. We tell you that there are urban poor people living in all parts of China, living in all sorts of cities around the world, whose government imperative to fund them and provide them basic infrastructure is damaged when they have to do it in an inefficient manner. So, is this about choosing between people? Mr. Speaker, we tell you it's not, because the cost of providing infrastructure to newly built areas in various cities around the world is substantially more than the cost of providing infrastructure to areas which densify more. We told you that this debate was not about people continuing to live in rural poverty or moving into cities. It was a choice about building up or building out, and it's cheaper for government to build up through the collection of services. Literally no response to that. The second point which they had regard to this was this idea of do governments have the capacity to enforce these areas? They just said that in Rio, well, governments can't enforce it, so clearly that's a problem anyway. First of all, we'd say that just because the Brazilian government is a particularly good at enforcing things doesn't mean that green zones can't have an application in various places around the world, guys. Like, that was just small burden setting. But secondly, even to the extent we acknowledge that some governments have an issue in protecting green zones from development, we tell you that there is always going to be more development in green zones when you allow property developers to go massively gung-ho about it than when government has an imperative to stop development there. The fourth thing they told us about was that green zones were applied inconsistently, that governments have an obligation to protect people. Again, guys, not the debate. We told you there are circumstances in which green zones work really properly. But to the extent where we acknowledge that some green zones are applied inconsistently, we say to you that all green zones have the capacity to try and incentivise people within the existing urban area to develop that area more. So they always have the incentive to make use of land more efficiently. Because here's the thing, guys, we think rich people who have massive backyards will always be able to make more money if they then sell those backyards to someone to build an apartment block. That is what urban densification looks like in the real world. And we told you that that didn't matter even if those things were inconsistently applied. Secondly, I want to talk about the environmental impacts of this model. What Daniel told you at first was this idea that, well, if we create green zones, eventually they're going to have to go, and when they do, the poor little bunny rabbits won't be quick enough to wander out of there, so they'll kind of be trapped in through a pincer movement of development. First of all, when you have a green zone, it is a green zone. That is an argument for not destroying the green zone and preserving it and continuing to encourage urban development up. But secondly, guys, seriously, destroying a green zone happens under your models because you abolished green zones in the first place. The animals are still dead, the flora is still dead. At the very least, under our model, there is a chance of it surviving. Second thing I wanted to talk about, and I really like this point, was how you change internal opinions by doing this. How this allows government to provide more money to the education system so you can have, sprightly, hipster young professionals who really like the environment. Here's what we tell you about that. What their point was that these people will then push for environmental policies which protect the environment and also, help improve how we distribute energy in our society. Like green belts, Mr. Speaker, we absolutely tell you that this is one of the things which is encouraged by that tertiary educated population or by that population when they get better informed about environmental policy. Third point on social stuff. What we've told you very clearly is that currently there is a mismatch between the costs which are borne by society when cities develop and the people who pay for those costs. So we've told you that was through things like infrastructure. Their point on this was that, well, that's okay because we think development is an imperative. We think that developing nations have an imperative to tell their people to make sure that they get jobs in the city and to remove them from rural poverty. What we tell you, Mr. Speaker, is that inefficiently using government resources to build social services in cities for people there discriminate against the rural poor who have to pay for those services through things like tax but can't get the benefit of it. Guys, funding inefficient services to massive urban sprawled cities hurts the people who live outside those cities as much as it hurts the people who live within the green zone boundary at that point in time too. The only people who benefit are the small margins of people who do move into those new environments as a result of that. So, I've got 2 points I want to raise to you in substantive today. Firstly, I'm going to talk about food and how this would damage food security in many nations. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how this can lead to social enemy as it encourages outward development. So, firstly, on food. Mr. Speaker, we acknowledge that this mainly relates to the third world. We think that whilst as countries develop and become more and more urbanised, there is an absolute advantage for certain nations to maintain their agricultural bases and to keep people in agricultural employment. We think this is for a couple of reasons. First of all, we think food provides a stable export revenue, which is really important for certain nations, particularly given their foreign currency reserves. We think secondly, it improves domestic food security, something which is really important when you have massive changes in a society, which often accompanies political changes. We acknowledge that wage disparities will probably always exist between rural and urban environments. So what this policy then does is it makes sure that people who move to cities pay the full cost of doing that, because it makes sure that governments don't have to take money away from poor and rural communities and incentivise, instead build infrastructure in cities where these people are required. So we think what this does is this does have the impact of discouraging some people from moving from these rural environments to the city. We think there is a social benefit of that because we think that as much as developing too slowly is a harm, developing too quickly is a harm, particularly when it inhibits other people's development and it takes government away from other important government programs. Second point I want to talk about substantive is how green zone belts can help discourage social enemy. This mainly relates to the first world. What we tell you here is that green belts help incentivise urban development and urban density development. What we also tell you is that the lack of greenbelts incentivise massive urban sprawl. We think that has a number of problems when it comes to things like social bonds. We think if people don't live around each other, we think when they don't have the shared use of facilities, it's far more easily to be socially isolated from a community. We think it's far more easy to just cut yourself off from the rest of the community and develop a fortress mentality. To the extent where people want that, we tell you that in certain cities there is no choice but to live in suburbia, so you can't even opt into that system. We think that social enemy and social isolation causes many harms, of which are manifest. Because at the end of the day, we don't think this debate was ever a distinction between poor people and rich people. We think it was about a distinction between environmental destruction and infill urban development. We're more than happy to propose.
Ladies and gentlemen, the conception of the negative team about the way that greenbelts actually operate was the idea that they managed to stymie the type of development that those guys thought was problematic, and that they managed to supposedly preserve the type of rural communities that Max wanted to talk about. The fantasy land that the negative team were actually living in was based on the fact that the reality of the way these greenbelts operate is that these cities continue sprawling, is that these cities continue creating smaller satellite cities that exist just outside that greenbelt, but that you don't have the ability to get into that city as quickly to be able to use the resources that that city would be able to use, and that means that the people who live outside are necessarily shut out. That was the realistic characterization that the negative team needed to respond to in today's debate. Outside of that characterization, all their analysis simply amounts to an anti-growth rant that makes no sense in the context of today's debate. I've got 3 questions at the end of today's debate. Firstly, why do greenbelts fail at achieving their most fundamental aims? Secondly, why are they unfair to society's most disadvantaged? And then thirdly, how do we best mobilise support for environmental change? And my God, my voice is going. Okay, so firstly, why do greenbelts fail at achieving their most fundamental aims? And we gave you 3 ways at the start of this debate in Daniel's speech about why greenbelts failed at achieving what they wanted to achieve. We said, firstly, they ensure that the sprawl continues in a more broader sense. They mean that satellite cities are created. Because guess what, negative team? The reality of cities like Sao Paulo, which these guys said they didn't want to make the debate about, despite the fact that that's the most pressing impetus, is that there is still an incentive for individuals to drive 3 hours to work in Sao Paulo. That type of development is always going to exist, and there's always going to be the incentive for people to spend that 3 hours trying to commute into the city, and for all the harms that that creates. We said that that creates environmental harms in and of itself. It means that resources aren't used inefficiently. It means that you're not able to give resources to those people themselves, but it also means that it's done inefficiently and un-environment and in ways that are bad for the environment. But secondly, we said that governments were politicised and in some instances were corrupt, which meant that they were moving greenbelts back at arbitrary rates, which means that they never served that function which they were put in place to serve in the first place. But secondly, that they were moved at a whim, which we don't think delivered the returns that they were ever able to deliver. Thirdly, we said they failed even at protecting the wildlife that existed within those areas to begin with. We think it's better just to get rid of those animal populations and move them off into other areas entirely, rather than systematically moving them every 2 or 3 years, such is the rate of development in these countries. The way that the negative team then framed this is that it came down to a simple trade-off between whose incentives are better, between developers versus the government themselves. We've already given you a few reasons for why the government's incentives here are less than perfect. But here's why we think that developers' incentives work perfectly right here. We were told that developers don't bear the full costs of people moving into the city, so they have worse incentives. We think that developers rely on the demand of people who want to use that land and will use that land in whatever way is most efficient for the people throughout that city. We think that that means that maybe more people will move in because it will be more efficient to create housing there. Maybe it means that that's somewhere where businesses will spring up. Either way, we think that the incentives of the market to determine that type of thing are such that the market determines how the developers go about it, right? They're not just this big evil body that goes out and does whatever they want. But secondly, that the incentives of the government to continually push back the green belts bit by bit, year by year, means that they were never able to achieve their original aims in the first place. We think that in general, the more people moving into those areas that are developing are better. We think that that means that you can have better services for those people because you're able to just use those services over that area that they're systematically excluded under the status quo. We think that means that people move closer into the city, they can work longer, don't have to commute for as many hours. That creates a growing middle class, that creates the demand that Steph said was really good for environmental reform, but also means that it just grows those people's wealth and grows those people's utility anyway. But then these guys told us, well, green zones can sometimes be applied inconsistently, but we don't have to defend that. What they missed was that we told you at Golder that it was intrinsic, that they necessarily were administered poorly. It was intrinsic by the nature of the green zones themselves. Because developers can't always watch over them, because there is always an incentive for people to squat in those areas that are closer to the cities, that have better access to those resources. Those are intrinsic problems, guys. You can't just say these are the worst case scenarios, we don't have to defend them. We said that they're intrinsic for those reasons. But then secondly, they told us that people react and build more sensibly if we don't have areas like this. We think there is already an incentive for developers to develop upwards or develop sustainably or whatever. We think that you will already create demand because that land is necessarily scarce under either scenario, right guys? That land is automatically scarce regardless. But then there was substantive material at second about the benefits of rural things and like that people then pay the full cost for being in rural. That misses the dichotomy. You still have development of satellite cities outside of these large towns. You still have people driving 3 hours from basically what becomes a sprawling megalopolis. That is problematic. We don't think it really does much to those people from the rural community at all. If it means they have to pay a full cost, as these guys want to characterise it, we said that was horrible. We said it was incredibly unfair to say that only the people who could afford to live in the middle of those green belts reap the benefits of it. We said that that was terrible, and you're going to need to do something to principally defend why it is fair to prop up that state at the expense of people who can't afford to live there to begin with, if you want to run that argument to begin with. The second tier of this was, well, there's social isolation. We think social isolation occurs when you stratify the people who live outside of the greenbelt with those who live within it. That's the function of your model. We thought that was problematic. So second question, and I've sort of touched on this to some extent already. Why are greenbelts unfair to society's most disadvantaged? And we told you that you artificially inflate the prices for people living within the greenbelt, necessarily excluding people of lower socioeconomic status. We don't know what they meant when they said people have to pay the full price, as they said in substantive, which I just responded to. But they told us a few things in response. They said it's better for services and it's better for transport for those people of lower socioeconomic status. But this just presumed that people took the greenbelts and accepted them, rather than the reality of how we told you people reacted to the presence of greenbelt throughout society. People in Sao Paulo still drive 3 hours and create sprawling megalopolises because of the way that these greenbelts operate. People still squat in the greenbelt and still live in horrible circumstances where they don't have access to those services. So the fantasy land where they say, well, theoretically you could get better services if you're able to isolate them, does not apply in today's debate at all. We don't think that that was ever justified because the growth does still occur throughout society, and that is so much more problematic regardless of what those guys want to say. So, final question. How do we best mobilise support for environmental change? And we said that in any case, firstly, this proposal was unfair to society's poorest without justification. Secondly, this proposal didn't provide the benefits that these guys wanted to talk about in relation to green belts in the first place. So even if we can't provide an environmental benefit by repealing green zones, we still think we're ahead on this ground. But we gave a few points of analysis about why we think we can. Steph said in her substantive that when you think things like these have been done, you think that the reforms have been made in regards to environmental concerns, it means that it stymies the capacity to do other things. She said secondly that it was a particularly populist reform that precluded other types of reforms. But thirdly, at Daniel, we told you that it was mutually exclusive when you put in types of place the enormous resources that you need to put in place to prop up these green belts that are systematically failing at the expense of all the other types of areas that developing countries necessarily have to pump resources into at the same time. We said that what that means is that you can take a focus away from other areas that do need to be reformed, that do need that environmental change, but also that you take away from the impetus of individuals who want to reform that themselves. Ladies and gentlemen, the negative team need to deal with the reality. Growth still sprawls, these cities still end up with horrible services, and where people from the outskirts are systematically excluded. That's a horrible scenario. We beg to repeal.
Thank you very much, Tim. And now I'm going to call on Ben.
Hong Kong, before they implemented the Greenbelt, you had urban sprawl in the form of shanty towns that the government was coming in and tearing down every 3 months or so, existing. They were commuting to Kowloon Tong and the Peak for 3 hours a day, taking cars. That was what the new territories looked like before government enforced a green zone. The reason being was because economic activity in that developing territory was so spread out and so sprawled. No industry was setting up, no centralised urban hubs were setting up. The Hong Kong government had implemented a green zone that forced that urban migration to the new territories to be concentrated in a centralised location. That resulted in industry propping up inside the new territories, which meant they didn't have to commute to Kowloon Tong and the Peak for 3 hours every day. That resulted in it stopping being a satellite town because they no longer had to migrate for a large amount of times. It stopped it being an urban shanty town that the government came in and tear down every 3 years because the way in which the poor were moving into this region was to build up and to centralise as opposed to build out. Sao Paulo has always been flat. Ghettos have always existed on the end of Sao Paulo, and since its existence, it has priced poor people out of the market and has had satellite cities for the last 40 years. They never proved a causal link between the green belts and the problem of Sao Paulo. They said they both existed at the same time, and therefore they were a problem. Greenbelts in countries like Hong Kong and China have been used to fix the problems of satellite cities, have been used to fix the problems of shanty towns that deny economic activity to the poorest people, because the biggest absurdity in their case was that greenbelts stopped poor people moving into cities. Greenbelt stopped poor people moving into cities in Sao Paulo because they do not know what building up looks like. Sao Paulo has been a scroaming, rolling city since its conception that priced poor people out of the market. The difference is that governments can use Greenbelt as an economic incentive to provide real and meaningful opportunities when people migrate. Sao Paulo is fucked and will look the same under either team's model, which is why we didn't really want to engage with it in first. Because countries like Sohito, which have very similar circumstances, look exactly the same without the Greenbelt they wanted to point the problem to in this debate. We told you all of this in Shane's very first responses to your material, and we have literally not had the dignity of a response across 2 speakers in this debate. I'm going to look at 3 questions. Does this policy hurt the poor? Does it protect the environment? 2 questions, sorry. Here we go. So firstly, they said we had an obligation to the poor in the form of development. We agreed and we never challenged this. The question in this debate was not about locking poor people out of cities, it was how government managed them moving into cities in the first instance. In that regard, the problem isn't greenbelts leading to the problems they wanted to save. The point of it is this, right? If you have functional governments that can set things up that allow people to move into cities, but you force the poor people to move into existing territories, or you concentrate the area of land in which they can move into in newly developing cities, that changes the incentives of developers when building things like apartment complexes in the first instance, and it also changes the functional options that people have when moving into those cities. In that regard, their conception of how this would play out for people on the ground was fundamentally false and flawed, because the way they wanted to conceptualize the world was wrong. You're not locking poor people out of moving into cities, but what you are doing is saying when you move in, you have to live in geographically concentrated areas outside of shanty towns. Why is that better? Shane told you at first why that was the case and why it was better. He told you fundamentally it was better because the reason there are huge crime rates in the shanty towns that exist under their side of the house is because the government has been unable to concentrate people, things like poverty, and in that regards can't target policies at specific regions that are crafted around greenbelts and crafted in specific zones, and they can't do things like maximise policing outcomes because policing is to an extent based on per capita resources, but it's also based on land, right? It's harder for police to police situations of crime in poor countries when the poor are spread across a huge mammoth zone. In that regards, if you use greenbelt as a crafting tool to concentrate the areas in which those poor are allowed to migrate into, you increase the capacity to do things like fight crime in the first place. This policy wasn't about locking poor out of cities, it was about the way in which they chose to engage with the cities. We told you that right from first, they never responded in this debate. Secondly, environment. What was their conception of the environment in this? They had 2 arguments. Well, sorry, before I do that, I'm going to look at government corruption. They wanted to say that government corruption was fundamentally structural and integral to green zones. The government of Hong Kong has not changed the green zone in the new territories once. If it is structural and necessary, why is that the case? Why has that government been able to resist all the functions? I concede that San Paulo is fucked and their government is corrupt. That was hurting them before the green zone existed. It will continue to hurt them after you abolish the green zone. It means they will do things like just let people build shanty towns around the edge of the city. And if the extent to which that changes under your model is so minimal, I couldn't understand why this was meaningful material for your side of the house. They are able to be administered structurally without corruption. That is certain because it's been done in countries like China and Hong Kong. And the fact that the San Paulo government is corrupt does very little to benefit your side of the house in this debate. So secondly, environment. What were their two arguments on environment? Firstly, they told us we have to raise the middle class to care about environmental outcomes. That was hugely predicated on them winning the point about who developed the poor better. We tell you, centralised education, being able to concentrate poor areas makes it more easy for government to give them access to education. It minimises the burden of government, providing the very things they wanted to say were so important to dealing with long-term environmental change. In that regard, if you want to raise the middle class, green belts have been and will continue to be an effective tool. Secondly, they wanted to say that squatters are bad. Firstly, squatters are not as bad as the alternative. The alternative is literally a carte blanche building ground in that environmentally sensitive area. When environmental sensitivity is genuinely a concern, squatters will never be able to match the clout of my general unregulated full-on migration into that area. In that regards, this policy does something meaningful in that. Thirdly, they wanted to say this. They wanted to say that we shouldn't really prioritise environmental protection over development. We told you they were the one and the same. The Chinese government has used green zones to do things like when they feel an urban population has reached a certain size, to prevent the purchasing of land around that urban zone for the creation of large factories and coal plants that will produce smog that will inhibit the ability to develop that population and to protect the environment. We told you right from the first that things like carbon capture and the ability to protect very tree-heavy zones, which are very good at capturing carbon by the natures of photosynthesis and what trees do, when you don't provide protection from those from government and you say carte blanche entry policy, you necessarily make that worse. And in that regard, you don't get either outcome you want on this side of the house, because you inhibit development in the long run by not protecting environmentally sensitive pieces of land, and you deny capacity to develop in the short run because you make environmental pollution a problem, you make smog a problem, and you increase situations in places like Tuvalu where carbon emissions are massively undermining their capacity to administer their people. This debate was not a choice about artificially locking poor people out of land. Poor people in San Paulo could not afford to live in the city of San Paulo in anywhere except either the ghetto fringes or the satellite communities under either team's model. What this debate is about is when it is possible for poor people to move into zones, how we manage that migration and how we incentivise business development at that point. We told you right from the start, across the bench, government has an obligation to incentivise building up, to increase the capacity of the market to innovate new ways to concentrate populations, to reduce their capacity to produce things like smog and carbon around them, and ultimately to concentrate government resources in specific and select zones in regards to things like education and policing. All those things I told you at first, we had no response across their bench. We were proud to stand in opposition.
Alan, thank you for that speech, and now call on Shane to comment.
Empirically, Sao Paulo looks the same as countries without green belts. The green belt was not the problem, it was a failure of government. I told you that in Ravana at first, and we told you that all down the bench. Conversely, green belts were the solution in Hong Kong, the solution in China, and the solution in Macau. Two questions. The effects of green belts on the environment and their effects on society. On the environment, we told you, one, that why green belts kept cities contained, so you don't have to spread transport, facilities like health and education, and in doing so spread the environmental harms that they cause. Two, we told you that specific green belts protected public goods, like beaches, cultural sites, and natural carbon capture hubs. And three, we told you that to opt out of green belts is to lazily opt out of innovation in that way. All these things were important because they came with a human cost, but it was a cost that the market didn't recognize because the market did not value positive externalities. The market, secondly, did not consider future consumers, and the market, thirdly, didn't consider people impacted by the transaction, but not actually in that commercial transaction. We got a few responses to this. Their first response was that satellite cities would spring up. But firstly, we told you that they do so under your model, and it's not even organized, because there'd be a mad rush from developers to buy up this land on the cheap and get ahead of the market. Secondly, we told you that this was a problem of enforcement and of government, not of green belts as a whole, that we could solve. And thirdly, we told you that there was an economic incentive for satellite cities not to spring up. Because why would you choose to drive 3 hours every day when you could live in a high-rise apartment and take a bus to work anyway? But even if you didn't believe all that, we told you that empirically, it was more common in cities like Macau, China, and Hong Kong for these cities not to spring up when you had any half-decent government enforcing the Green Belt policy. Then they told us, squatters would still exist and you couldn't enforce that. But at the very least, even if we couldn't enforce squatters not existing in that case, we told you that it wasn't as bad as the unregulated, unmitigated migration from developers that would overwhelm these areas and would be far worse for the environment than squatters. Then they told us that, poor people can't move to cities. But if that's true, we told you that poor people can't move to the satellite cities you're talking about either. We think that poor people are more likely to be able to get enfranchised in the cities that we're talking about at the point where there is innovation and the public services do get cheaper for these poor people to move into those cities. Then they let's talk about the effects of society. We told you firstly that you have to provide services to cover the amount of land as well as the number of people. So it's more efficient for transport, health, education, and policing when the populace is collected, not strewn out all over the place. Secondly, we told you that the problem of service providers was exacerbated when the poorest people under their model lived the furthest away from these cities. Thirdly, we told you that greenbelts were unique in their flexibility and far more useful than fighting hundreds of court cases against rich developers for many different reasons all at once. And finally, we explained that empirically, governments like China use greenbelts to contain service provision when they just couldn't afford to spread out that service provision otherwise. They gave us 2 responses. Firstly, they told us that developers and the market are more efficient, but we had 3 responses to this. Firstly, we told you that the market never considered things like externalities. The market never considered things like future consumers. And I told you that at first, but it got scant response. Secondly, we told you that the market where developers buy and sell willy-nilly on the cheap cannot be the most efficient system. And thirdly, we told you this. We told you that developers don't care about the provision of services. Developers don't care about schools and hospitals because they just don't pay for that. So we think that the market doesn't solve in this way. And finally, they told us that there would be an incentive to innovate anyway. To which we said all down the bench, not really. When you need more space, the solution is always to build a new house away from the city. Need clearer air, build a new house away from the city. Need cheaper plots of land, build a new house away from the city. We think that for all these reasons, because greenbelts help the environment and help society, we oppose.
Thank you, Shane. Diamond.
Speaker, the highlight of this debate was when the negative team at last looked at the impetus for this debate. They looked at poor people in shanty towns, they looked at the failed environmental policy, and they said too hard and gave up. Instead, they rested their case while claiming to be standing up for the poor on a country which uses violence, executions, and coercive force in order to prevent the poor and keep from accessing resources and keeping them in a state of perpetual poverty. This debate tracked 3 key issues. What greenbelts were we talking about and why had they failed? Secondly, which team here gave you superior environmental outcomes? And thirdly, which team gave you desirable social outcomes? Because the affirmative team and eventually the negative team recognise that environmental policy ultimately serves human aims. While Earth will always be here, we're talking about people in this debate. The first question on what greenbelts were we talking about and why the debate sort of split into 2 key classes of green zones. There were the realistic green zones around cities in democratic countries. This was Brazil. This was even the green zone in New York City, which Steph dealt with later in her speech. And the negative team essentially said these had failed because of government corruption. A government that was so corrupt that they were willing to trust with encouraging responsible development within cities and which was always be superior to developers. We said that in these particular situations, the greenbelt and the corruption was particularly intractable. It was just the nature of poor people to want to move into these zones, and they had a right to move into these zones. And under those circumstances, blocking them out from government services had essentially and would inevitably continue to fail. The second class of green zone they wanted to deal with were those in totalitarian states, where the government was willing to use any and all coercive force necessary in order to lock people out of Hong Kong, in order to lock people out of Beijing. And we dealt with those not by saying that China hadn't succeeded, but what they were doing was morally and environmentally reprehensible. The debate then moved on to the idea of environmental outcomes. And the new narrative you essentially got from the negative team was this. Developers were evil and would have carte blanche out there to go and destroy all of the environment before them. What you needed was responsible development, the type you could finance in the world's financial capital of New York City, which could presumably then be applied to the poorest places on Earth just as easily. They then tracked on to saying you could essentially encourage food security and people in rural communities. We'll come back to that in a moment. What the affirmative team told you was a couple of factors here in terms of environmental reform. Firstly, opportunity cost, something that was never picked up in this debate, was the fact that it was extremely expensive to hold on to extremely expensive government land and use resources on that when there was cheap but equally environmentally valuable land that could be protected out in the rainforests, out in the rural communities. Secondly, we explained that in order to mobilise populations in favour of environmental reform, you needed to first allow them a bite and a chance at development. You needed to allow them to access the chance to eat, the ability to have a job before they could start caring about environmental policy. That by forcing people to live in squalor as they proposed, you were essentially mobilising the bulk of your population against environmental policy. Thirdly, we showed you the green zones themselves just had failed from an environmental aspect generally. They tended to be enveloped. They didn't protect the flora and fauna. They failed in that respect. So let's get back to what they said the other environmental benefits were. They talked about protecting food security. They talked about forcing people to pay the full price of development. And they talked about people being encouraged to remain in rural communities. That leads on to this idea of social cost. Because ultimately the premise here, if you put those three things together, is a world in which people are forced to stay out of the cities. They are forced to stay in the rural state of poverty which China has forced them to do. They rested their hat on saying, we accept that people have a right to actualise themselves, and they stood up for the example of their country which has locked 80% of its population in an environment where they can access none of those services as a matter of inevitability. What the affirmative team in this debate said was, those poor people are our first priority. They have a right to have food, they have a right to have jobs, and they don't have to be locked out into the cold. If anyone in this debate should have been paying the cost of this development, it was the people who were already in those cities. It should have been the people who were already in Hong Kong, the people who were already in Beijing, the people with the resources and the ability to do so. Mr. Speaker, at the end of the day, we recognise that environmental policy serves people. This was actually bad environmental policy that hurt the poorest and the most vulnerable. We were proud to not give up on them at the end of this debate.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Thank you very much, everyone. And I'd encourage you to put